Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I am honored to have back with me today on this show an absolute hero of mine, and I know a hero of many of yours as well, Dr. Ron Paul. As a former Republican presidential candidate and U.S. Congressman and father of Senator Rand Paul, Dr. Paul needs no introduction, especially to those of you listening to me on this show. Before we go any further, I do want to make sure that my listeners are aware of an event coming up on September 10th in Washington, D.C. at the Marriott Hotel at the Dulles Airport, and that is the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity 2016 conference. Ron himself will be there, so you would have a chance, I believe, to meet up with him and perhaps say hello to him. That alone, I think, is worth more than the $55 admission price. But Ron and others like Daniel McAdams, who is oftentimes on this show, will be there to speak. So if you understand the issue of foreign policy and how our current policies contradict the very basic ideals of what we were supposed to be celebrating yesterday, which was I believe the 240th birthday of our nation, or simply want to meet up with Dr. Paul, I would suggest you really look into attending this event on September 10th at the Marriott Hotel at the Dulles Airport. And go to ronpaulinstitute.org, ronpaulinstitute.org, to sign up for this event, and not only that, but also to learn of a lot of very important information with respect to foreign policy. And I believe that Dr. Paul and Daniel McAdams provide a daily commentary on events that are very, very important to our nation. So there's lots of reasons to go to the ronpaulinstitute.org. Given Dr. Paul's reverence for the Constitution as well as the Declaration of Independence, I wanted to have him on this day after the nation's birthday, in order to ask him to give us a little national physical exam, perhaps in terms of how we are living up to the ideals expressed in the words of Thomas Jefferson in that Declaration of Independence back in 1776. And then, based on his assessment as to how well we have followed the spirit of the Declaration, I want to ask him for a prognosis for our country if we continue on the same path as we have been traveling. Let me just quote briefly that very famous paragraph, the second paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are initiated among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." End of quote. Dr. Paul, in your view, has our form of government become destructive towards the self-evident truths that we the people are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights?
Well, first, Jay, thank you very much for having me on and putting the plug in for our conference in September. But that is a very significant part of the Declaration of Independence, and I frequently sort of allude to that sort of in a disappointing way, because I think in many ways we haven't protected what Jefferson and others tried to do. That it turned out to be a failure. I hope it's not that bad, but even Jefferson thought that it took a lot to maintain this, and thought that you had to have a revolutionary spirit every 20 years in order to preserve your liberties. But the paragraph you read, I think it's important because it talks about the nature of government. And I think governments do come from the people, even when you have various forms of government, just not governments designed where you have a constitution like ours. But he talks about just powers coming from the consent of the people. So even when you have an authoritarian government, there is a subtleness of the consent of the people. Just recently we saw that the consent of the people got set up in Britain, and they decided that they wanted to express themselves. So people's sentiments and their consent is very, very important. But it also means that it establishes this moral right. Where does the government get this power? That is what I think has been lost, because right now we have the total special interests, total control, where you have the military-industrial complex, where you have the people who benefit from the monetary system and all the deficit financing. And people say, well, we have to do that. That's how you have a healthy economy. And other people who have suffered the consequence, the predictable destruction of the middle class that comes from destroying a currency, puts a lot of people in jeopardy, and not necessarily their fault. But the entitlement system, the people who have been living through entitlements and forced transfer of wealth, they're suffering. They don't even see this as a problem because entitlements have become right. And they don't even think about where does the government have this just power? Where does it come? When does the government consent? They believe that as long as you can manipulate the system and get a so-called majority vote, rights are not protected. And, of course, the most important thing is protecting the rights of the minority and never allowing the dictatorship of the majority. The founders were very clear on this. They didn't want a pure democracy. They wanted a republic. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have much of that. I think the spirit of liberty is growing once again because things are so bad economically and our foreign policy in such shambles. I think it's fantastic. I talk to a lot of young people, so I'm, optimistic to a degree that the spirit is coming alive again. And, of course, I do my very best, as you do, to keep that spirit alive and well.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting because from whence do those powers come? By what do we gain our rights? And, Jefferson mentioned the creator, capital C, creator. To the extent that notion of a supreme being is lost, do you think, Dr. Paul, that may then lead to some sort of tyranny? Because after all, if there aren't some absolute laws written into the way we're supposed to behave as human beings, won't people oftentimes find excuses or reasons to depart from sort of those basic laws about how we're supposed to treat each other? The golden rule, for example.
Yeah, and I think the founders, even though they might not have been themselves considered, religious promoters, they talked about a moral people. The people have to be, for this system to work, you have to have a moral standard. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little bit, I lean toward inclusiveness if I can, because I don't like theocracies.
Sure.
But this whole thing about most of the great religions have recognized the fact that you don't start with aggression. Even if you go back to Hammurabi Code or the Ten Commandments, it was pretty sound stuff. Don't kill people, don't rob from people, and don't hurt people. I mean, those moral standards were well known for as long as we have recorded history. It's impressive to me that very early in human history, those thoughts were very much clear. And the founders knew this. I mean, they actually had a good understanding of the background of the Judeo-Christian ethic, and it is based on nonviolence. And I think this is something that is, if you lose that, if they reject this notion, then it doesn't work. And I often use the Bastiat principle. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Bastiat principle.
Sure.
That if you and I can't go to our neighbor when we're hungry or we want something and they have more than we do, that we have the moral right to take it. And most people still believe in that, and that's the principle that people see. But they have been totally confused with this idea that, well, the purpose of government is to do our dirty work for us, and we will organize, and we will use government guns. I get so annoyed with these anti-gun people that want to take our guns away from protecting our families, and they turn around and they use government guns all the time to try to get their way in order to distribute the wealth the way they think it should be.
Well, it's certainly the ideal, Christian ideal anyway, is to help those less fortunate. And I think a lot of times liberals get confused with Christianity. Liberal Christians anyway, they sort of believe that, well, we'll just let government do it, and that way I don't have to. But my view of Christianity is that, and I think my Jewish friends agree with this as well, that we need to take care of those around us, starting, of course, with our family, and that way the government doesn't have to. But as I understand, Dr. Paul, in the past you've talked about a couple of major ways that we've gone off the rails with respect to what our the constitutional mandate was for our country. One focuses on the monetary system and the other on foreign policy, and the two, as you've pointed out, often are very closely related. Maybe we could talk about the monetary system first, if that's all right.
Sure.
As I understand it, the Constitution calls for Congress, not a central bank, to have the powers of the purse, yet to safeguard the likelihood that Congress might abuse that power, it strictly defined the dollar or money in terms of a set amount of gold and or silver, I believe. Do I have that right?
That is right, and they did that immediately after the Constitution was written with the Monetary Act of 1792 to try to do exactly that, define the dollar as a weight.
So contrary to the Constitution, it seems to me now, what congressional control of the monetary system do we have? I mean, you sat on the House Banking Committee. You questioned Alan Greenspan and Bernanke and others, but it seems to me that it was sort of a show more than anything. That Congress wasn't really in charge. The Federal Reserve was. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it is, and it's the people's fault because they tolerated the Congress not minding their own business. So the Congress, the people didn't say much when the Congress said, well, let's give it to this secret body of people who will design the monetary policy and nobody knows what's going on, and we ended up with this monster that we have now. Of course, this is part of the reason the limitation of government power and the protection of liberty was destroyed because there was a financing ability to do this. So, they tax us a lot, but the real tax and the real evil is when they can print money out of thin air. So the monetary policy is big time, the big issue. And of course, I've said many times that one of my motivations to getting involved in speaking out on monetary policy in a political arena was having studied Austrian economics and what was going on, and as the Bretton Woods was coming unglued in the 1960s, gold was leaving this country, and we knew that they were abusing the Bretton Woods pseudo-gold standard. And of course, when it climatically ended at Bretton Woods in 71, that's when I thought, well, I'm just going to, get involved in at least speaking out. So that was my goal all along. But monetary policy is key. It's the way you finance the military. It's the way you finance the welfare state. It's the way you take care of friends, the military-industrial complex, the banking industries. And then this was incorporated into the development of the Keynesian theories on economics, that government planning is important. We don't live in a free society where the economy is a free system and people get to keep what they earn and interest rates are set by the market. We have a system of total intervention and rules and regulations and thousands of pages of regulations, something that British sort of got tired of, but they got tired of it mainly because Brussels was writing all these regulations. But I'm hoping the American people get sick and tired of it. But I think our election today reflects what's happening, although I haven't, in the current crop that's speaking out or in contention right now, I don't see many of them talking about, the importance of monetary policy. I still think it's an important issue, and it's very, very clear in the Constitution that there should be, because they were really penalized by the inflation of the continental dollar, and that's why they tried desperately to prevent that. So, like it was in so many things on protection of liberty, the Congress and the people have been negligent in trying to protect us against the bad monetary system.
Well, indeed. I mean, you were the only presidential candidate among the Republicans the last time, that spoke out about monetary policy. This time I was hopeful that Senator Cruz might do so, but once your son dropped out of the race, he seemed to go silent in terms of audit the Fed or go back to a gold standard. So I lost all hope with respect to any of the Republican candidates. But I'd just like to read a quote that I picked up from something that you said on the floor of the House back in January 18th, 2006. You stated, and I quote, "The consequence of this system," meaning the Federal Reserve and the monetary system, the consequence of this system, fully in place for the past 34 years, and this was in 2006 when you said this, are astronomical and impossible to accurately measure. Industries go offshore and the jobs follow. Price inflation eats away at the middle class and deficits soar while spending escalates rapidly as Congress hopes to keep up with the problems it created, end of quote. Well, Dr. Paul, I'm understanding very easily the concept of money printing leading to inflation. That's an easy one to understand. But can you help me connect the dots between money creation and how that leads to jobs going overseas? I mean, this is a thing that Donald Trump is talking about. Bernie Sanders is very, very concerned about jobs leaving, good jobs leaving. He'd like to just, of course, mandate higher prices for hamburger flippers and so forth. But can you help us understand the connection between money printing and jobs that are leaving our shores?
Well, there's a big difference. If a country just prints money like Zimbabwe, they just destroy their own country, or somebody like Venezuela. It doesn't work. But if you're a country like ours that's a powerhouse, and we also get to issue the reserve currency of the world, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because you have to have something in reserve if you're running a banking system, even a free market banking system, which hopefully would use gold and silver as the reserves. But if the dollar is the reserve, and you use that to back your currency, the paper dollar is backed by treasury bills. So the more debt you run up, the more treasury bills have, the more money you have. Well, when you have the reserve currency, people will take it. And we have been powerful. We have the military power and the economic power. So it's very tempting for other nations to take our dollars. So the nations that, have a different standard, whether it's Mexico or at one time Japan and now China, they take our dollars. And that means we don't have to make these kind of things because it was tempting for these dollars to go. So we export our inflation. We don't suffer the consequences. We get to buy these cheap products. We get cheaper labor, but it's a consequence of bad monetary policy that does this. Now, you say, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. In a way, it is a good deal for a while, but eventually, they give up because, unfortunately, the Chinese, they could have done this, but they could have taken our dollars and not monetized it. So if we spend $10 billion over there, they just print up $10 billion of yuan, and then they use $10 billion to send back to us and help prop up our debt. So it's a quid pro quo. It's helpful, to both sides, but it's unstable. It's not good policy. It's sort of like saying, wasn't the housing boom great? Easy credit, low interest rates. Give everybody that wants to buy a house, the government makes them give them a mortgage. Well, yeah, until it ends, and then of course people lose their jobs, they lose their houses and everything else, and that's why the bubble finally is bursting in China and different places. So I think it's very directly related. Now we could compensate a little bit for that. Well, first we shouldn't have a reserve paper currency.
Sure.
That's the real evil. But when you have trade problems, it's easy to blame somebody else, but we should look to ourselves. What can we do for ourselves? And that is quit printing money, quit inflating, quit manipulating the interest rates, quit running up deficits, quit writing these regulations, and make sure it's competitive because, I do think the American people still can compete, but we've created the artificialness that exists. But to say that, well, it's only one country's fault, the Chinese are at fault, so what we have to do is punish them and put on tariffs. I'm not for any of that stuff because I think that's just treating the symptoms and it's missing the point, and it leads to other things going wrong later on.
Yeah, well, you wonder, because Donald Trump, of course, is talking a lot about China and they're at fault, and you just wonder to what extent. I doubt then that either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump understand what you just said in terms of the connections. And it seems to me also, Dr. Paul, that if we can print money, it's a little bit like the mafia don printing money and getting what he wants without having to work for it on a massive scale, of course. But it would also, I would think, cause us to be less competitive because we haven't had to be competitive. We could just have this sort of monetary narcotic, if you will, to sustain us for a while. But then, as you point out, ultimately doesn't work very well. Yeah.
No, I think that's a perfect example. If the mob gets to print the money, it's worthless, but if they do a good job and people think it is, they do benefit for a while until somebody figures out, well, this is really counterfeit. And what we're dealing with is immorality in the monetary system because it is counterfeit, and that's why you get up and get into so many of these problems. But competition is what you want to preserve, not protection for certain companies, that we so often do. And unfortunately, when conditions get bad, the corporate world get bailed out. They get benefits as it goes up because they get to use the money first before the money is diluted and the prices go up for the middle class. So it becomes less competitive, and I don't think we do a good job. But your point that we need to be more competitive, but you need to give the incentive to be. Don't allow anybody to get these special favors, and then to survive, you have to be competitive if you know you can keep the rewards of your labor.
Well, my discussion with Ron went on too long to air the entire conversation this week, so I will play part 2 of my discussion with Dr. Paul, this premier champion of liberty, next week. In the second part of my discussion with Dr. Paul, he addressed the following topics. Alan Greenspan's remarks recently on Bloomberg Television that the U.S. would do well to go back on a gold standard, and also Greenspan's remarks about inflation, why he fears that we may be experiencing some ugly effects of inflation in the near future. Also, Dr. Paul discussed how this money printing by the Fed continues to fund wars that are making America less safe, not more safe, and also how a buildup of gold reserves among Eastern countries like China may indeed trigger a monetary default in the United States that could finally put an end to the wars that the United States is constantly getting itself into. In other words, an internal default, if you will, that will bring down the empire, much as happened in the Soviet Union. But towards the end of my discussion with Dr. Paul, I did put the following question to him as we closed the interview. One final question, if you could, Dr. Paul, and that is there any real reason, given what we've just talked about, to celebrate the 4th of July? Yesterday we celebrated the 4th of July. If, in fact, we've turned the Constitution, or at least the Declaration of Independence, seemingly, from my perspective, on its head, should we abolish the 4th of July?
No, I think we should use it to emphasize the efforts that the founders put into it, and they were willing to go and separate themselves from England and show us that secession is not such a bad idea. Emphasize that. And also to tell the people the truth. We should celebrate truth, and on the 4th of July, we ought to be honest with ourselves and not say that we who might argue what we've been talking about, that we're unpatriotic, and say what real patriotism is. For me, real patriotism is a willingness to work hard to understand what's going on and not to defend our government when they're wrong. And I don't think there's anything unpatriotic about that. I think it's unpatriotic to allow these people to get away with talking about what we should be doing, how we want to run the world. And that's where I see a great danger.
Well, that is all the time we have for this week, but Dr. Paul, as I noted, will be back next week to talk about America's monetary and foreign policy future.